Welcome to a journey we're going to take together through some of the most storied resting places in the world. We're here to remember 50 actors who left us too soon. Some of them were just getting started when they were taken. Others were in full bloom. All of them, in one way or another, left a mark that never quite faded. So let's begin. Our first stop is also, in many ways, the most fitting place on Earth to start a tour like this one. We're in Fairmount, Indiana, a small farming town, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, and the grain elevators are taller than anything else on the skyline. Park Cemetery sits on the edge of town, quiet and unhurried, the kind of burial ground that has been here so long the older stones have sunk slightly into the grass. And somewhere in this ordinary, decent place rests one of the most extraordinary young men the movies ever produced. James Dean grew up right here in Fairmount, raised by his aunt and uncle on their farm after his mother died when he was just 9 years old. He milked cows in the mornings and dreamed of something bigger in the evenings. And eventually, he made it to New York, to the Actors Studio, to Broadway, and then to Hollywood. His first substantial film role came in East of Eden in 1955, and director Elia Kazan knew immediately he had something rare on his hands. Dean played Cal Trask with a coiled, almost desperate emotional intensity. You could practically feel him thinking. That same year came Rebel Without a Cause, the film that made him a generation's spokesman without him ever giving a speech. "You're tearing me apart!" That single line, shouted at his movie parents, somehow spoke for every teenager in America who felt misunderstood and unmoored. Then came Giant, filmed alongside Rock Hudson and Elizabeth Taylor, a sprawling Texas epic in which Dean played Jet Rink from ambitious young ranch hand to self-destructive oil baron. He was 24 years old. He had made 3 films. And on September 30th, 1955, driving his Porsche 550 Spyder on Highway 46 near Cholame, California, he collided with a Ford Tudor sedan that turned into his path. He was pronounced dead that evening. The film Giant hadn't even been released yet. He received 2 posthumous Academy Award nominations, for East of Eden and for Giant, the only actor in history to receive 2 posthumous acting nominations. His grave here in Fairmount draws visitors from around the world, fans who come to stand in the Indiana flatlands and pay their respects to a boy who came from here and somehow became eternal. From a small Indiana town, we travel now to West Los Angeles, to a quietly tucked-away spot you might easily drive past without noticing, Westwood Village Memorial Park, which sits in the shadow of high-rise apartment buildings in one of the most expensive zip codes in the country. It is a remarkably small cemetery for the number of legends resting here, and the first one we'll visit is perhaps the most famous woman of the 20th century. Marilyn Monroe was born Norma Jean Mortensen in 1926 in Los Angeles, and her early life was genuinely hard. An absent father, a mother in and out of psychiatric institutions, years spent in orphanages and foster care. The girl who would become the world's most photographed woman spent much of her childhood without a stable home. She was married for the first time at 16 to a young man named James Dougherty, partly so she wouldn't have to return to an orphanage when her foster family moved away. That's the kind of start she had. But by the early 1950s, the transformation was complete, and Marilyn Monroe, the name she had chosen, the character she had built, was a force of nature that Hollywood had never quite seen. Her comic timing in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and How to Marry a Millionaire proved she was more than a pretty face, and her work in Bus Stop and Some Like It Hot, widely considered one of the greatest comedies ever made, showed something approaching genius. Billy Wilder, who directed her in Some Like It Hot, famously said that despite all the difficulties on set, the moment the camera started rolling, something happened that he'd never seen before or since. The takes with other actors were difficult because she required so many. She reportedly said the line, "Where's the bourbon?" dozens of times before Wilder got what he wanted. But when the film was cut together, the result was perfection. Tony Curtis, her co-star, was less charitable about her in interviews. The film won neither of them any argument. It simply made them both immortal. She was nominated for a Golden Globe for Some Like It Hot and won a Golden Globe for Best Actress in a Musical or Comedy for her performance in The Prince and the Showgirl. But it was the Academy Award that eluded her, nominated only once for Bus Stop in a year when the competition was fierce. And you get the sense it would have pleased her to win one. She took acting classes with Lee Strasberg at the Actors Studio and took the craft seriously in ways that her image as a blonde bombshell sometimes obscured. She married Joe DiMaggio in 1954, a union that lasted 9 months but produced one of American history's great love stories, and later married playwright Arthur Miller, a marriage that lasted 4 years and encompassed the making of The Misfits, her final completed film, written by Miller and co-starring Clark Gable. Gable died of a heart attack shortly after the film wrapped. The production had been brutal, shot in the Nevada desert in extreme heat. Monroe's own health was fragile. She was attempting a comeback in 1962, working on a film called Something's Got to Give, when on the night of August 4th, she died of acute barbiturate poisoning at her home in Brentwood. She was 36. Joe DiMaggio, heartbroken, arranged red roses to be delivered to her crypt 3 times a week for 20 years. He never remarried. Her modest crypt at Westwood is one of the most visited in the world, and on any given afternoon you will find people there. Not tourists exactly, but something more like pilgrims. We'll stay right here at Westwood for a moment, because this small cemetery holds a remarkable number of stories. A short distance from Marilyn rests another actress who became bound up with Hollywood's most mysterious and haunting chapter. Natalie Wood, born Natalia Nikolaevna Zakharenko in 1938, daughter of Russian immigrant parents, was a genuine child star who made the rarest of successful transitions to adult leading roles. You likely know her best from Miracle on 34th Street, in which she played the little girl who may or may not believe in Santa Claus. That was 1947, and she was 9 years old. By the late 1950s, she was starring alongside James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause. And yes, we did just visit him, and earning an Academy Award nomination for her Trouble. 3 more nominations followed, for Splendor in the Grass, Love with the Proper Stranger, and Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice. West Side Story in 1961 gave her perhaps her most beloved role as Maria, though in one of Hollywood's more peculiar decisions, her singing was dubbed by Marni Nixon. She married actor Robert Wagner twice, the same man with a few years apart in between, and had a career that stretched warmly into the television era. Then, on the night of November 28, 1981, while aboard a yacht off Catalina Island with her husband and actor Christopher Walken, she drowned. The circumstances have been debated and investigated for decades, and the case was reclassified as a drowning investigation in 2011. She was 43 years old. Her grave here at Westwood was later joined by her mother, and visitors often leave flowers and notes. From Westwood, we head to the rolling grounds of Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City, which has become one of the most densely star-populated burial grounds in the Los Angeles basin. We'll return here more than once today, because this cemetery holds several of the most poignant stories on our entire tour. We'll start with one of the darkest chapters in Hollywood history. Sharon Tate was 26 years old in the summer of 1969, newly married to director Roman Polanski, 8.5 months pregnant, and by any measure a star on the rise. She had been luminous in Valley of the Dolls, charming and funny in The Fearless Vampire Killers, and her career was clearly only going to grow. On the night of August 8th, members of Charles Manson's cult broke into the house she was staying in on Cielo Drive in Los Angeles and committed one of the most horrifying murders in American history. Sharon Tate, her unborn child, and 4 others were killed. The case, the Manson murders, shook Hollywood to its core, and, many historians argue, marked the end of the idealistic spirit of the 1960s in America. Manson himself would spend the rest of his life in prison, dying there in 2017. Sharon's grave here at Holy Cross is shared with her infant son, Paul Richard Polanski, the child who never had the chance to be born. Her parents, who outlived her by decades, are buried nearby, and her mother, Doris, spent years attending parole hearings for Manson's followers to help ensure they remained incarcerated. There is a quiet dignity to this spot that the passage of more than 50 years has not diminished. Now we make our way to one of the grandest addresses in all of cemetery history, Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. The grounds here span more than 300 acres of manicured rolling hills, and within the Great Mausoleum, a massive structure inspired by Italian Renaissance architecture, rest some of the biggest names in Hollywood's golden age. We'll spend quite a bit of time here today because Forest Lawn Glendale has more of our 50 than any other single location. The first name we're looking for here is one that defined a certain idea of Hollywood glamour so completely that she became shorthand for it. Jean Harlow was the original blonde bombshell, platinum-haired, wisecracking, frankly sexual in a way that was genuinely new to the screen. Born Harley and Harlow Carpenter in Kansas City in 1911, she drifted into films almost by accident, and then Redheaded Woman and Red Dust and Dinner at 8 happened, and there was no turning back. She had a gift for comedy that her earlier publicity never quite prepared audiences for. She could deliver a withering line with the timing of a veteran while looking like a goddess. Clark Gable was her most frequent co-star, and their chemistry was genuine and electric. What makes her story linger is what happened in 1937. She was filming Saratoga with Gable when she fell gravely ill. Her symptoms had been worsening for months. She was exhausted, bloated, struggling. But her Christian Scientist mother refused to allow conventional medical treatment. When she was finally hospitalized, it was too late. She died of acute kidney failure on June 7, 1937. She was 26 years old. William Powell, her fiancé, was grief-stricken. Powell paid for her tomb here in the Great Mausoleum in a private room called the Sanctuary of Benedict. She never made another film. Saratoga was completed using a double and a voice actress and released posthumously. It was a box office hit, audiences hungry for one last glimpse of her. Just across the way here at Forest Lawn, Glendale rests another woman whose death came far too early and carried far too much wreckage with it. Carole Lombard was quite simply the funniest woman in Hollywood in the 1930s, the queen of screwball comedy, the actress who could make audiences forget they were watching someone perform and believe they were watching someone simply live. My Man Godfrey earned her an Academy Award nomination in 1936, and Nothing Sacred and 20th Century and To Be or Not to Be cemented a reputation for comedic brilliance that has only grown with time. She was also, by all accounts, one of the most genuinely warm and funny people in an industry that sometimes manufactures both qualities. Her marriage to Clark Gable, whom we just met in passing through Jean Harlow's story, was one of Hollywood's great real-life romances, and by the early 1940s they were living on a ranch in Encino that they called their sanctuary. In January 1942, just weeks after Pearl Harbor, Lombard went on a war bond tour. She was enormously successful at it, selling $2 million worth of bonds in a single day in her home state of Indiana. On the flight home on January 16th, TWA Flight 3 struck the face of Table Rock Mountain near Las Vegas shortly after takeoff. All 22 people aboard were killed. Carole Lombard was 33 years old. Gable was devastated and enlisted in the Army Air Corps almost immediately after her death, reportedly no longer caring what happened to him. He served with genuine bravery, flying combat missions in Europe. President Franklin Roosevelt called Carole Lombard the first woman killed in action during World War II. A designation not technically accurate, but a reflection of how the nation mourned. She rests here in the Freedom Mausoleum, entombed alongside her mother. While we're still on the grounds of Forest Lawn Glendale, let's pause for another actress whose story deserves far more attention than it typically receives. Carole Landis was one of the most vivacious and appealing actresses in early 1940s Hollywood. A comedienne and leading lady who starred opposite Victor Mature, whose grave you might have seen on a different tour through this same cemetery. She worked steadily through the war years, and she was one of the most active performers for USO tours, traveling to Africa, Great Britain, and other theaters of war to entertain troops. She logged more miles entertaining servicemen than almost any other Hollywood star of the era. What she got in return for that sacrifice was a kind of exhaustion, emotionally and physically, that the post-war years never seemed to quite heal. In July 1948, she was found dead in her home by actor Rex Harrison, with whom she had been having an affair. She had taken an overdose of sleeping pills and died by her own hand at the age of 29. Rex Harrison, who was married to actress Lily Palmer at the time, was not charged with any crime, but the scandal clung to him for years. Carole Landis's grave here at Forest Lawn is a quiet reminder that the glamour of Hollywood in its golden age frequently concealed tremendous personal unhappiness. Staying at Forest Lawn, Glendale, we come to a story that plays out in a very different key. Wilder, more flamboyant, and culminating in one of old Hollywood's most talked-about departures. Lupe Velez was known as the Mexican Spitfire, a nickname that started as the title of a film series she made in the late 1930s and early 1940s, but that also fit her personality to a T. Born in San Luis Potosi in 1908, she came to Hollywood in the late 1920s, and her energy was volcanic. She sang, she danced, she did slapstick. She played dramatic roles with genuine fire. She had a long and stormy romantic relationship with Gary Cooper that was the talk of the town, and later married Johnny Weissmuller, the Olympic swimmer who played Tarzan, with results that were predictably dramatic. She was in 16 films in the Mexican Spitfire series alone, and her comedic timing was sharp and self-aware. In December 1944, she was 36 years old, pregnant, unmarried, and, by her own accounting and letters she left behind, unwilling to raise a child alone and in what she felt would be shame. She ended her own life with an overdose of sleeping pills. The story of her death acquired lurid embellishments over the years, most of them false, including a tale about where her body was found that was an invention of gossip columnist Kenneth Anger. The true story is simply a woman in desperate circumstances who saw no way forward, a sadder and quieter story than the sensational version that circulated. She is buried here at Forest Lawn in a section called the Garden of Remembrance. Also, here at Forest Lawn, Glendale, we find the grave of a woman who should have been one of the biggest stars in Hollywood history, and by any just measure was. Dorothy Dandridge was the first African-American woman to be nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress, nominated for her breathtaking performance as the title character in Carmen Jones in 1954. Let that settle in for a moment. 1954. The country was still segregated in most of its institutions, and here was this woman, 28 years old, lighting up the screen with a performance of such smoldering intelligence and complexity that the Academy could not ignore it. She went on to star in Island in the Sun and Porgy and Bess, and she performed to packed houses in the finest nightclubs in Las Vegas, though the same hotels that booked her would not allow her to sleep in their rooms or swim in their pools. She had a relationship with director Otto Preminger, who cast her repeatedly, but who also, many accounts suggest, treated her carelessly. Her marriage to a restaurateur in the early 1960s was a financial disaster that left her in serious debt. On September 8, 1965, she was found dead in her apartment in West Hollywood. The cause of death was an overdose of an antidepressant, ruled accidental. She was 42 years old. Halle Berry won the Academy Award for Best Actress in 2002, the first African-American woman to do so, and dedicated her Oscar to Dorothy Dandridge. Her grave here at Forest Lawn is a quiet mile marker in the long, hard history of black artists in American entertainment. One more stop on these particular grounds before we move on. And it's a story that connects to James Dean, our very first stop today, in a way that feels almost too perfect. Nick Adams was one of the young actors who came up alongside James Dean in the mid-1950s, a member of that loose cohort of restless, intense young men who were transforming Hollywood's idea of what a movie star looked and sounded like. He was a close friend of Dean's, and after Dean's death he did something both touching and a little strange. He became almost professionally associated with Dean's memory, telling stories about him in interviews, inserting himself into the Dean mythology in ways that were not always strictly accurate. His own career was real enough. He starred in the television western The Rebel for 4 seasons, starting in 1959, and he received an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor for Twilight of Honor in 1963. By the late 1960s, his career had declined, and on February 7, 1968, he was found dead at home from an overdose of paraldehyde, a sedative. He was 36 years old. The coroner ruled it accidental, though the circumstances were unclear enough that questions lingered. He is buried at Forest Lawn, not far from the grave of a friend, Sal Mineo, whom we'll visit shortly, completing a small, mournful cluster of the short-lived young actors of that particularly intense Hollywood era. Still at Forest Lawn, Glendale, we pause at the grave of a young comedian whose story is one of the most genuinely heartbreaking on this tour. Not because of the circumstances of his death exactly, but because of the terrible timing of it. Freddie Prinze was Puerto Rican and Hungarian, born in New York City in 1954, and by the time he was 19, he had performed on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson and launched a career that moved at dazzling speed. His NBC sitcom, Chico and the Man, debuted in 1974 when he was 20 years old, and it was a massive hit, one of the most watched shows on television, pairing him with veteran comedian Jack Albertson. Prinze was funny in the particular way that the best stand-up comedians are funny, with a rhythm and a confidence that seemed completely natural, like he'd been born knowing where the jokes were. Johnny Carson called him one of the most naturally gifted comedians he'd ever seen. He was also very young and living very fast, with substance abuse issues that the people around him could not seem to slow down. On January 28, 1977, after calling several friends to say goodbye, Freddie Prinze shot himself in the head in his apartment. He was 22 years old. His son, Freddie Prinze Jr., born on March 8, 1977, just over 5 weeks after his father's death, grew up never knowing him and would go on to become a successful actor in his own right, perhaps best known for She's All That and the Scooby-Doo films. Now we travel east across the country, all the way to a windswept cemetery on Martha's Vineyard, Abel's Hill Cemetery in Chilmark, Massachusetts, a place that has been burying islanders since the 1700s. The gravestones here lean at various angles, worn by Atlantic salt air, and resting among them is someone who came to the vineyard in life and returned to it in death. John Belushi was one of the founding cast members of Saturday Night Live, a show that premiered in 1975 and changed the course of American comedy in ways that are still playing out today. His physical comedy was staggering. A samurai warrior, a bumblebee, a Greek diner owner shouting "Cheeseburger, cheeseburger," the killer bees, the briefcase-wielding Jake Blues. His film work was equally explosive. Animal House in 1978 was one of the highest-grossing comedies in history up to that point, and The Blues Brothers in 1980, which he made with his partner Dan Aykroyd, combined genuine music with genuine mayhem in a way nobody had quite thought to do before. What's less widely known is how seriously Belushi took the craft of performance. He had trained rigorously at Second City in Chicago and carried a genuine actor's intelligence beneath all the chaos. But the chaos also extended to his personal life, and his drug use was on a scale that alarmed everyone around him. On March 5, 1982, he was found dead at the Chateau Marmont Hotel in Los Angeles. The cause was a combined drug overdose of cocaine and heroin, a combination known as a speedball. He was 33 years old. His grave here in Chilmark is marked with a stone that became so overrun with visitors and graffiti that he was eventually moved to a more private location within the same cemetery, and a decoy marker was left in the original spot. Even in death, John Belushi proved difficult to contain. From Martha's Vineyard, we head north to New York in a cemetery in Hastings-on-Hudson called Hillside Cemetery, a peaceful Jewish cemetery overlooking the Hudson River. We're here to visit someone who made millions of people laugh and, in the end, faced something no amount of laughter could fix. Gilda Radner was, alongside Belushi, one of the original Saturday Night Live cast members, and many who watched that first season would tell you she was the heart of it. Her characters were not just funny, but lived in and specific. Emily Latella, the elderly woman who didn't quite hear the news correctly, Rosanna, the garish commentator, Lisa Lupner, the nerdy teenager. She was the first performer cast for SNL, and Lorne Michaels has said he built the rest of the cast around her. She married comedian Gene Wilder in 1984, and by all accounts, their partnership was deeply happy. In 1986, she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. She lived with the diagnosis for nearly 3 years, and during that time she wrote a memoir called It's Always Something, the title a Rosanna catchphrase, which was honest and funny and brave. She died on May 20th, 1989, at the age of 42. Gene Wilder was devastated, and he spent years afterward raising awareness about ovarian cancer, frustrated that her symptoms had gone undiagnosed for so long before the cancer was caught. He said in interviews that she had complained of fatigue and vague discomfort for months and been misdiagnosed repeatedly. Gilda Radner's grave here is a place where fans still leave flowers and small notes, tributes to a comic genius who burned bright and went out too soon. Moving now to Beth David Cemetery in Elmont, Long Island, we're in search of perhaps the most genuinely puzzling figure on our entire tour. A man whose relationship with reality, or at least with other people's understanding of reality, was a performance in itself. Andy Kaufman was not, strictly speaking, a traditional actor. He was something stranger and more unclassifiable. A performance artist who used the forms of television comedy and professional wrestling to explore questions about authenticity, audience, and what it meant to entertain. His character Tony Clifton, a belligerent, incompetent lounge singer whom Kaufman insisted was a real person separate from himself, was so committed that Kaufman occasionally had other people play Tony Clifton in public, so that he and Tony Clifton could appear in the same place simultaneously. His role as Latka Gravis on the television series Taxi, which ran from 1978 to 1983, brought him a mainstream audience that had no idea what to make of his other work, which was exactly how he wanted it. He was diagnosed with a rare form of lung cancer called large cell carcinoma in 1983, unusual in a non-smoker, which he was. He died on May 16, 1984, at the age of 35. And because Andy Kaufman had spent his career blurring the line between reality and performance so thoroughly, a persistent rumor arose that his death was itself a hoax, the ultimate Kaufman bit. It was not. But the fact that the rumor exists and has never quite gone away is, in a strange way, the most fitting epitaph his life could have earned. He rests at Beth David Cemetery, and fans have visited his grave for 40 years. Some part of them still not entirely sure he's there. We travel now to Madison, Wisconsin and Queen of Heaven Cemetery, where we find someone who, if the term force of nature has any meaning at all in the entertainment world, more than qualifies. Chris Farley grew up in Madison, the son of an oil company owner, and he was apparently exactly like this his whole life. Boundlessly energetic, physically uninhibited, desperately eager to make people happy. He came up through the improvisational comedy world at Second City in Chicago, the same institution that had trained Belushi a generation earlier, and when Saturday Night Live hired him in 1990, the comparison was immediate and unavoidable. He was big, he was fast, he was willing to hurt himself for a laugh, and he had, beneath all the physical comedy, a genuine sweetness that kept him from ever seeming mean-spirited. His motivational speaker living in a van down by the river is one of the great SNL characters of any era. His film work, Tommy Boy, Black Sheep, Beverly Hills Ninja, found a huge audience. He also had, like Belushi, serious problems with drugs and alcohol, and he knew about the Belushi comparison, and it frightened him. He talked about it publicly. On December 18, 1997, he was found dead in his apartment in Chicago at the age of 33. The cause was an overdose of cocaine and morphine, the same combination that had killed Belushi 15 years earlier, to the eerie detail. He was buried in Madison, the city he'd grown up in, and his grave here at Queen of Heaven draws visitors who remember not just the comedy, but the warmth underneath it. Phil Hartman was 49 years old when he died, and his death was among the most shocking and violent on this tour. Not because of drugs or driving or illness, but because of a single gunshot on a quiet night in an Encino suburb. Hartman was, by most accounts of people who worked with him, the most reliable performer on Saturday Night Live during his 8 seasons there from 1986 to 1994. The Glue, cast members called him. the steady professional who could be trusted to make any sketch work. His impressions, Bill Clinton, Frank Sinatra, Ed McMahon, were uncanny, and his ability to find the absurdity in the straight man's role was a gift that writers could rely on. He went on to news radio, to Phil Hartman voicing characters on The Simpsons, to a film career that was just beginning to gain real traction. By all measures, he had a long and productive career ahead of him. On May 28, 1998, his wife Bryn, who had been struggling with substance abuse and mental health problems for years, shot him while he slept. She then drove to a friend's house, returned home, and took her own life. Both of them were gone before morning. Their 2 young children were asleep in the house. Phil Hartman's ashes were scattered in the waters off Santa Catalina Island, a place he had loved. There is no grave to visit, only a memory of a man who was funny and kind and taken in a way that was absolutely senseless. We are heading now to New York City, specifically to a Quaker burial ground in Brooklyn called the Friends Cemetery, which is exactly as serene and unpretentious as it sounds. It is not a place you would necessarily associate with the turbulent, self-tormented life of our next subject. Montgomery Clift was, alongside Marlon Brando and James Dean, one of the 3 young actors who fundamentally changed what American screen acting looked and sounded like in the post-war years. He was introspective, technically precise, psychologically complex in a way that older Hollywood acting had rarely attempted. A Place in the Sun in 1951 earned him his 2nd Oscar nomination. He had already been nominated for The Search in 1948, a film about a displaced child in post-war Europe that is still genuinely moving. And From Here to Eternity in 1953 gave him a 3rd. In that film, as Robert E. Lee Pruitt, the bugler who refuses to fight on principle, he created one of cinema's great portraits of integrity under pressure. He was also, notably, strikingly handsome in a delicate, haunted way that the camera seemed to love, and he knew how to use that quality rather than simply rely on it. There is an irony in his friendship with Elizabeth Taylor. They were close friends, genuinely so, and it was at her dinner party in the Hollywood Hills in May 1956 that his life changed. Driving home afterward, his car left the road and struck a telephone pole. Taylor was first to reach him, reportedly pulling 2 teeth from his throat to prevent him from choking. He survived, but his face was significantly reconstructed, and the man who emerged from that accident was visibly different, more troubled, more reliant on alcohol and prescription drugs, more at the mercy of the demons he had arguably always carried. He had already been keeping his homosexuality hidden in an era when that required constant vigilance and constant energy, and the accident stripped away whatever protective shell had been holding things together. He received a 4th Oscar nomination for Judgment at Nuremberg in 1961 as the American judge presiding over the Nazi war crimes trial, a small role that he made unforgettable in a single scene. He died on July 22, 1966, from heart failure, the cumulative effect of a decade of hard living. He was 45 years old. He is buried here in Brooklyn, in a Quaker cemetery that fits his quiet, serious nature more than Forest Lawn ever would have. From Brooklyn, we travel back to the New York area, up to Westchester County and Gate of Heaven Cemetery in Hawthorne, which is a place we might have visited for any number of reasons, since it holds figures ranging from Babe Ruth to James Cagney. But today we're here for a man whose death, at the age of 37 on a street in West Hollywood, was one of the ugliest chapters in the story of celebrity in America. Sal Mineo came to Hollywood through Broadway. He had played the young prince in The King and I on stage at the age of 11, and by his mid-teens he was in the movies. His role as Plato in Rebel Without a Cause in 1955, and yes, we have now connected 3 people directly to that single film, earned him an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actor, and he became, almost overnight, a teenage idol. His dark good looks and the emotional vulnerability he brought to troubled youth roles made him enormously popular through the late 1950s and early 1960s. He was nominated for a 2nd Academy Award for Exodus in 1960. As the 1960s wore on and the clean-cut teen idol market faded, his career declined, and he struggled to find work that fit either his age or his talents. He was directing and acting in theater when, on the evening of February 12, 1976, he was stabbed to death in the carport of his West Hollywood apartment. He had been robbed. The killer was caught and convicted more than a year later. A drifter named Lionel Williams, who had committed numerous other robberies in the area. Sal Mineo had nothing to do with the crime. He was simply in the wrong place. He was 37 years old, and he is buried here at Gate of Heaven, not far from his family. Our next stop brings us to another actress whose brief career and brief life were entwined with the story of a man we've already met. James Dean, our first stop of the day. This is someone Hollywood never adequately appreciated. Pierangeli was born Anna Maria Pierangeli in Sardinia in 1932, and she was genuinely beautiful in a way that the movies of the 1950s could barely contain. Dark-eyed, soft-spoken, and possessed of a natural acting ability that directors noticed immediately. Teresa in 1951 and The Silver Chalice in 1954 established her, and MGM had significant plans for her. But the most important thing that happened to her in Hollywood was not a film. It was a romance. She and James Dean fell deeply in love in 1954, and by multiple accounts the relationship was real and intense and serious. Her mother, devoutly Catholic and protective, did not approve of Dean, and in 1954 Pierre married singer Vic Damone instead, reportedly with Dean watching from his motorcycle across the street from the church. The marriage to Damone did not last, and neither did a subsequent marriage. Her career faded through the late 1950s and 1960s, and she moved back and forth between Europe and America. She died on September 10, 1971, of an accidental overdose of barbiturates at her Beverly Hills apartment. She was 39 years old. James Dean had been dead for 16 years. A letter was found suggesting she had never stopped thinking about him. She was brought home to California and is buried in the Los Angeles area, a quiet footnote to one of Hollywood's most talked-about romances. While we're here at Holy Cross, let's visit someone whose death was not accidental and not self-inflicted, but utterly senseless, the result of being in an industry that sometimes forgets what's at stake when it cuts corners. Dominique Dunne was 22 years old, just beginning what looked to be a genuinely promising career when she was murdered by her former boyfriend, John Thomas Sweeney, in the driveway of her West Hollywood home on the night of October 30th, 1982. She had appeared in Poltergeist that year, playing the older daughter Dana, in a film that became one of the most beloved horror films of the decade. Her family is one of the most accomplished in American cultural life. Her father was writer Dominique Dunne, her uncle was writer John Gregory Dunne, and her aunt was Joan Didion. Sweeney strangled her after she broke off their relationship. He was convicted of voluntary manslaughter, not murder, and served less than 4 years in prison. Her parents' public anguish over what they considered an inadequate prosecution and sentence became one of the driving forces behind California victims' rights legislation, and her father wrote about the case with a pain that never diminished. She is buried here at Holy Cross in Culver City, and her story was part of what motivated Congress to pass the Victims' Rights and Restitution Act of 1990. 22 years old, a life that was just beginning. Still here at Holy Cross, and the story we're about to tell is one of the most heartbreaking on the entire tour because of the age at which it ends. Heather O'Rourke was 12 years old when she died. She had first appeared before the public as Carol Ann Freeling in Poltergeist in 1982, the little girl with the luminous face pressing her hands against the television screen saying, "They're here." She was 5 years old when they filmed that scene. She went on to appear in Poltergeist 2 and Poltergeist 3, and she had also become a regular presence on Happy Days, where she played Heather Pfister in several seasons. She was, by all accounts, a delightful child who brought genuine warmth to every set she worked on. In early 1988, she developed symptoms that her doctors initially misdiagnosed as Crohn's disease. On February 1, 1988, she went into cardiac arrest caused by a septic shock stemming from an acute bowel obstruction, a condition that, had it been diagnosed correctly earlier, was treatable. She died in surgery the next day. She was 12 years old. The Poltergeist franchise had not yet announced her absence, and the third film, which she had just finished filming, was released that summer with a dedication to her memory. Heather O'Rourke is buried here at Holy Cross, and her grave has been visited by fans of those films ever since. Let's step away from Culver City for a moment and head to Westwood Village Memorial Park, which we visited at the start of the day for Marilyn Monroe and Natalie Wood. There are several more stories waiting for us here, and the first belongs to a man who was brave in a way that, in 1991, required almost inconceivable courage. Brad Davis is best remembered for his searing, fearless performance as Billy Hayes in Midnight Express in 1978, a young American imprisoned in a Turkish prison, subjected to brutality and exploitation, desperately trying to survive and escape. The film was a sensation, and Davis's performance was its engine. He could have been a major star coming out of it, and for a period in the early 1980s, it seemed like he might be, with roles in Chariots of Fire and Querelle. But the reality of his life was complicated in ways that Hollywood didn't know, because he had deliberately kept them hidden. Brad Davis had been diagnosed with HIV in 1985. He and his wife made the decision to conceal his status entirely. In the mid-1980s, an HIV-positive actor in Hollywood faced blacklisting, loss of insurance, loss of work, so he continued working for years without telling the industry. He died of complications from AIDS on September 8, 1991, at the age of 41. His wife, Susan Bluestein, immediately disclosed his diagnosis publicly, speaking about why they had hidden it, and the letter he had written about his experience, "the industry's dirty little secret," he called it, became part of the public record of how Hollywood treated people with AIDS in the epidemic's worst years. His grave here at Westwood is a quiet but pointed marker. Also at Westwood rests someone whose brief career and even briefer time on Earth left fans of 1990s cinema genuinely bereft. Chris Penn, the younger brother of Sean Penn, had a long enough career to demonstrate considerable range, from the lovable Willard in Footloose in 1984 to a Golden Globe-nominated performance in Robert Altman's Shortcuts in 1993, to the menacing Eddie Nicholson in Reservoir Dogs in 1992. He was the kind of actor who lifted every scene he was in without seeming to try, and directors valued him for it. He had his older brother's intensity, but a warmer, rounder quality that made him easier to cast in sympathetic roles. He died on January 24, 2006, at the age of 40, of a dilated cardiomyopathy, an enlarged heart, complicated by the effects of multiple medications. He was found in his Santa Monica condominium. He was 40 years old, with what should have been many years of work still ahead of him. He is buried here at Westwood, not far from the section where Marilyn Monroe has rested for more than 60 years. From Westwood, we make our way to Oakwood Memorial Park in Chatsworth, in the western San Fernando Valley, a cemetery attached to a mortuary, modest and quiet, not a place tourists typically seek out. But the man we're looking for here has a story that is one of the stranger ones on this tour, and one that, in retrospect, carries a note of terrible inevitability. Bob Crane is remembered primarily for playing Colonel Hogan in Hogan's Heroes, the television sitcom that ran from 1965 to 1971, in which he played an American prisoner of war running an elaborate operation under the noses of his bumbling German captors. The show was controversial when it premiered, a comedy set in a Nazi POW camp, seriously? But it became enormously popular, and Crane's easy, charismatic performance was the reason it worked. He was nominated for 2 Emmy Awards for the role. What viewers didn't know, and what emerged with horrible clarity after his death, was the nature of his private life. Crane had become obsessively involved in a world of videotaping sexual encounters, facilitated in part by a friend and electronics enthusiast named John Carpenter. This was not the director. This was a different man entirely. On June 29, 1978, Bob Crane was found bludgeoned to death in his Scottsdale, Arizona apartment. He was 49 years old. Carpenter was tried for the murder twice, once in 1994, 20 years after the crime, and was acquitted both times. The case has never been officially solved. A 2002 film called Autofocus, directed by Paul Schrader and starring Greg Kinnear as Crane, told the story of his later life. He is buried here quietly in Chatsworth. Not far from Oakwood, heading toward Culver City again, we find Hillside Memorial Park, a beautiful cemetery with a notable Jewish population. Its most famous resident being Al Jolson, buried in a grand memorial visible for miles. But the person we're visiting today is someone whose death, in the early morning hours of July 23, 1982, put the entire film industry on notice that certain safety corners could not be cut. Vic Morrow spent much of his career playing tough guys, soldiers, and the occasional villain. He was a steady, workmanlike actor rather than a star, though television audiences knew him best from the series Combat, in which he played Sergeant Chip Saunders for 5 seasons beginning in 1962. What he is remembered for today, tragically, is the manner of his death. He was filming a scene for The Twilight Zone, the movie, directed by John Landis, in which he was supposed to carry 2 Vietnamese child actors through a river while a helicopter flew overhead. The helicopter, flying too low because of explosives being detonated on the ground, was struck by debris and lost control. Morrow and both child actors were killed. The children, Micah Dinley, age 7, and Renee Shin Yi Chen, age 6, had been illegally hired in violation of California child labor laws. Landis and 4 others were tried for involuntary manslaughter and acquitted, but the case transformed safety regulations on film sets in ways that persist to this day. Vic Morrow was 53 years old. Now we head to Forest Lawn, Hollywood Hills, a different forest lawn from the one we visited in Glendale, spread across the hills of Burbank overlooking the Los Angeles basin. This cemetery has its own significant population of beloved figures, and we'll visit several of them today. Brittany Murphy had that quality that is genuinely difficult to define, a guileless, electric spontaneity that made her characters feel like real people you had somehow already met. She was 22 when she played Ty Frazier in Clueless in 1995, and her transformation from dowdy outsider to confident young woman was funny and touching and memorable. She followed it with 8 Mile alongside Eminem, Just Married with Ashton Kutcher, and voice work in Happy Feet. She was, by the mid-2000s, a working actress with a broad range and a devoted following. On December 20, 2009, she was found unresponsive at her home in the Hollywood Hills and could not be resuscitated. She was 32 years old. The cause of death was determined to be pneumonia, anemia, and multiple drug intoxication, a combination of prescription medications. 5 months later, almost impossibly, her husband Simon Monjack died in the same house of the same causes. Investigators found extensive mold in the home, and theories about the deaths ranged from accidental to more troubling possibilities, but no criminal charges were ever brought. Brittany Murphy rests at Forest Lawn, Hollywood Hills, her short career a reminder of how much she had left to give. Also at Forest Lawn, Hollywood Hills, we come to the grave of a young man whose death in his own driveway still strikes anyone who hears it as grimly absurd. A small mechanical failure that ended a life in an instant. Anton Yelchin was born in St. Petersburg, Russia in 1989, the son of figure skaters who immigrated to the United States. He began acting as a child and built a body of work that by his mid-20s was genuinely impressive in its range. He played the young Chekhov in the rebooted Star Trek franchise beginning in 2009. He gave a heartbreaking performance in Like Crazy in 2011. He was funny and menacing in Green Room in 2015. And he voiced Clumsy Smurf in the Smurfs films. Directors who worked with him consistently described him as unusually prepared, thoughtful, and gifted. On June 19, 2016, early in the morning, he was found pinned between his Jeep Grand Cherokee and a brick pillar and mailbox at his home. His car, one of a model that had been subject to a recall for an unintuitive gear shifter design that could roll when drivers thought the car was in park, had rolled down his own driveway. He had apparently gotten out to check something, and the vehicle rolled and trapped him. He was 27 years old. The recall that should have fixed the exact model of vehicle that killed him had been announced just weeks before. He had appeared in nearly all the footage for the Star Trek Beyond film that was in post-production. It was released that summer and dedicated to his memory. One more stop at Forest Lawn Hollywood Hills, and the name will be familiar to anyone who watched action movies in the 2000s and 2010s. Paul Walker spent a decade making the Fast and Furious franchise one of the biggest movie series in the world, playing Brian O'Connor across 7 films with an affability and warmth that anchored the franchise through all its escalations. What is less commonly known is how seriously he took other kinds of work. He gave a nuanced, understated performance in Clint Eastwood's Flags of Our Fathers in 2006, and his philanthropic work was extensive, most visibly through his organization Reach Out Worldwide, which provided disaster relief. After the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, he flew in within 72 hours to help coordinate relief efforts. On November 30th, 2013, he was a passenger in a Porsche Carrera GT driven by his friend Roger Rodas. The car crashed and caught fire in Valencia, California. Both men died. Walker was 40 years old and was in the middle of filming Furious 7. The production shut down and resumed months later, finishing the film with a combination of previously shot footage and digital effects, and concluded with an extended farewell sequence for his character that became one of the most discussed send-offs in recent cinema. He rests at Forest Lawn Hollywood Hills. From Forest Lawn Hollywood Hills, we travel to Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City one more time. Because there are still stories here we haven't told. John Candy was one of the most beloved comedy performers of his generation. A big, warm, funny man who made audiences feel safe and happy in the way that only a few comedians ever manage. He came up through Second City in Toronto, through SCTV, the sketch comedy program that ran in the late 1970s and 1980s alongside a remarkable group of talents, including Martin Short and Eugene Levy and Catherine O'Hara, and into a film career that began with smaller roles and built steadily toward genuine stardom. Planes, Trains, and Automobiles with Steve Martin in 1987 gave him a dramatic weight he'd never shown before. And the moment near the end of that film when his character's loneliness is revealed is genuinely moving in a way that caught audiences off guard. Cool Runnings, Only the Lonely, Uncle Buck. He never stopped working. On March 4, 1994, in Durango, Mexico, where he was filming The Western Wagons East, John Candy died in his sleep of a heart attack. He was 43 years old. He had never quite stopped working at the pace that worried the people who cared about him, and the weight that had always been part of his image had contributed to a cardiovascular system under serious stress. His family brought him home to Los Angeles, where he had lived for years, and he is buried here at Holy Cross. A Canadian through and through, he left behind 2 children and a filmography that people return to constantly. We take a longer journey now, down to Puerto Rico, to the municipal cemetery of Bayamón, just west of San Juan, where a man rests who was born on this island and became one of the finest actors in American film during the final decade of his life. Raul Julia grew up in San Juan, trained in theater, and came to New York in his early 20s, determined to make it on stage. He did. He was a major Broadway figure through the 1970s and 1980s, nominated for 4 Tony Awards. His film career accelerated in the 1980s, and he delivered a series of performances that stand among the best work of that decade. Gomez Addams in The Addams Family, and its sequel, played with a comedic passion so over the top it became its own kind of perfection. Valentine in Kiss of the Spider-Woman in 1985, opposite William Hurt, a performance of extraordinary emotional depth. Romero in 1989, in which he played the martyred Salvadoran Archbishop Oscar Romero, was the film he said meant most to him. By the early 1990s, he had been diagnosed with stomach cancer, but he continued to work, and his final role, as the villainous M. Bison in Street Fighter in 1994, a film he took not for his own career but because his children were fans of the video game, was delivered with such theatrical commitment that it became beloved in its own right. He died on October 24, 1994, from complications of a stroke that followed stomach surgery. He was 54 years old. His body was brought back to Puerto Rico for burial, a final homecoming. From Puerto Rico, we travel northwest across the continent to Seattle, Washington, and Lakeview Cemetery, one of the oldest cemeteries in the Pacific Northwest, perched on Capitol Hill with a view of Lake Washington and the Cascade Mountains. Two people we're looking for are buried here side by side, and their story together is one of the most haunting on this tour. Bruce Lee was 25 years old when he burst into the consciousness of American audiences as Kato in the Green Hornet television series in 1966. He had been born in San Francisco to a Hong Kong actor father while his parents were touring the United States, and he had grown up in Hong Kong before returning to America at 18 to study at the University of Washington. He had been training in martial arts, specifically Wing Chun Kung Fu, since childhood, and his physicality was simply unlike anything Western audiences had ever seen. His speed was so extraordinary that cameras sometimes had to film him at higher frame rates and then slow the footage down so the action would be visible. His film career in Asia, particularly the Hong Kong films Fist of Fury, The Way of the Dragon, and Enter the Dragon, made him a superstar on a scale that is difficult to overstate. He had also been developing a Hollywood project called The Silent Flute, later realized as Circle of Iron, and had spent years trying to get American studios interested in a martial arts film led by an Asian actor. He was in the middle of that ascent when, on July 20th, 1973, he died suddenly at the Hong Kong home of actress Betty Ting Pei. He was 32 years old. The official cause of death was cerebral edema, swelling of the brain, attributed to an adverse reaction to the painkiller Equagesic. He was brought home to Seattle, to Lakeview Cemetery, and the crowds at his funeral were enormous. He was 32 years old with the career trajectory of someone who was just beginning. His son, Brandon Lee, is buried beside him. Brandon followed his father into acting, with a similar magnetism and a similar physical presence. He had inherited his father's explosive grace and the same quality of seeming completely at ease in front of a camera. He appeared in Rapid Fire in 1992, and in the spring of 1993 he was filming The Crow, playing Eric Draven, a rock musician who returns from the dead to avenge himself and his fiancée. It was the biggest production he'd been part of, and the role fit him in a way that felt almost fated. There was something about his combination of charisma and evident vulnerability that made the character work in ways the script alone couldn't guarantee. On March 31st, 1993, during a night shoot at Carolco Studios in Wilmington, North Carolina, a gun being used as a prop fired a real bullet fragment that had become lodged in the barrel during a previous setup. Brandon Lee was struck in the abdomen and died during emergency surgery several hours later. He was 28 years old. The Crow was completed and released in 1994 with a dedication to him and his fiancée, Eliza Hutton. Father and son rest here together at Lakeview Cemetery in Seattle, their graves drawing visitors who come to pay respects to two generations of an extraordinary family. Now we make a transatlantic journey to Paris and to Père Lachaise Cemetery on the eastern edge of the city. Père Lachaise is one of the most famous cemeteries in the world, the final resting place of Chopin, Oscar Wilde, Edith Piaf, Marcel Proust, and countless others. On a given afternoon, you can find visitors from every country on Earth wandering its tree-lined paths and elaborate tombs. We're here for the grave that draws more visits than almost any other in the cemetery. Jim Morrison was the lead singer of The Doors, and if you were young in the late 1960s, you understood why his face appeared on the walls of dorm rooms across the country. He had the look of a romantic poet and the voice of a preacher, and the songs, Light My Fire, Riders on the Storm, People Are Strange, The End, were genuinely unlike anything else on the radio. The Doors formed in Los Angeles in 1965 when Morrison met keyboardist Ray Manzarek on a beach in Venice, and Morrison recited some of his poetry, and Manzarek decided he needed to hear that voice through a microphone. They named themselves after Aldous Huxley's book The Doors of Perception, which itself borrowed from William Blake. Morrison was steeped in literature and film theory in a way that was unusual for a rock and roll frontman. He had studied film at UCLA, and the cinematic quality of his lyrics was no accident. He performed with an abandon that was captivating and frightening in roughly equal measure. There were concerts where he was transcendent, and concerts where he was barely coherent, and sometimes both in the same evening. He was arrested at a Miami concert in 1969 on charges of lewd behavior, charges that followed him for the rest of his life, and that he was convicted of posthumously before Florida Governor Charlie Crist issued a posthumous pardon in 2010. He also wrote poetry, which he took at least as seriously as the music, and which varied in quality from genuinely powerful to occasionally overwrought, as the poetry of young men in their 20s tends to do. He had been drinking heavily for years, and his weight had increased significantly by 1971, when he moved to Paris with his companion Pamela Courson, partly to escape the pressures of fame and partly to focus on writing. On July 3, 1971, he was found dead in the bathtub of their apartment in the Marais district. He was 27 years old. There was no autopsy. French law did not require one in this case, and the official cause of death was listed as heart failure. The specifics have been debated ever since. He was buried at Père Lachaise, and for decades his grave was one of the most heavily visited and, frankly, most heavily vandalized spots in the cemetery. Graffiti, crowds, discarded bottles, until the cemetery installed barriers and significant security. He joins a small and grim club of musicians who died at exactly 27: Robert Johnson, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Brian Jones, Kurt Cobain. The club was already well established before anyone gave it a name. While we're still in Paris, a short walk across the city takes us to Montparnasse Cemetery, a very different kind of place from Père Lachaise. Quieter, less visited, more intimate in its scale. Here we find an American actress who came to Paris and stayed, for reasons that say something both about her talent and about the America she had left behind. Jean Seberg was born in Marshalltown, Iowa, in 1938, and was chosen by director Otto Preminger, yes, the same director who had launched Dorothy Dandridge's career, from 18,000 candidates to star in his 1957 film Saint Joan. She was 17 years old. The film was not a success, and Preminger's second attempt with her, Bonjour Tristesse, fared similarly. Then a French director named Jean-Luc Godard cast her as Patricia in Breathless in 1960. And suddenly, she was something else entirely. A cool, cropped-haired American in Paris who became the face of the French New Wave and one of the most stylish icons of the early 1960s. What happened to her afterward belongs to one of the ugliest chapters in FBI history. Jean Seberg was a vocal supporter of the Black Panther Party, and J. Edgar Hoover's FBI conducted a deliberate campaign to destroy her reputation, including the planting of a false story suggesting her pregnancy was the result of an affair with a Black Panther leader. The story ran in Newsweek. It was a lie. She gave birth prematurely to a daughter who died after 2 days, and Seberg, shattered, displayed the baby's body in a glass coffin at a public funeral to prove the child was her husband's. She suffered severe psychological trauma from the episode and attempted to take her own life on the anniversary of the baby's death for years afterward. On September 8, 1979, she was found dead in the back seat of her car on a Paris street. She was 40 years old. The FBI acknowledged the smear campaign in 1979. Her grave here at Montparnasse is a quiet and dignified spot for a woman who deserved better from her country. We cross back over the Atlantic now and head to Ontario, Canada, to Pardes Shalom Cemetery in Thornhill, just north of Toronto. This is a Jewish cemetery, and we're here for someone who grew up not far from here and who, for a generation of young people who came of age in the late 1980s, was about as close to a definition of cool as anything on screen. Corey Haim had that irreplaceable teenage charisma, the kind that appears before a young actor knows he has it. That flash of genuine spontaneity that the camera captures and the audience keeps. He was 15 when he made The Lost Boys in 1987, playing the younger brother to Jason Patric's vampire-tempted teenage rebel. And his scenes with Corey Feldman, together they were simply the two Coreys to a generation, had a crackling natural energy. He had already appeared in Lucas, a genuinely fine performance in a 1986 film that deserved more attention than it got, playing a shy, intellectually gifted teenager navigating high school social dynamics. License to Drive and Dream a Little Dream followed, His personal life, however, was consumed from a young age by addiction. He has spoken, in his own words, about becoming dependent on prescription drugs as a teenager, and the downward spiral took decades to play out. He died on March 10, 2010, of pneumonia complicated by drug use. He was 38 years old. What might have been a full career, a grown man's body of work, went unrealized. His grave in Thornhill is visited by fans who grew up watching those VHS tapes on Friday nights. Back for one more stop among the cemeteries of the Los Angeles basin. And this visit is for someone whose story is, among all the stories on this tour, perhaps the one that lands most heavily on the question of what Hollywood can do to a person who is young and vulnerable and trusting. Jonathan Brandis came to fame the way many child actors of the late 1980s and early 1990s did, gradually through television guest appearances and smaller roles that added up to a recognizable face. He was Tommy in the 1990 remake of It, the Stephen King miniseries, playing opposite Tim Curry's Pennywise. His television series Sequest DSV gave him a dedicated following through the mid-1990s. He had what the industry calls bankability. Kids went to see things he was in, and his face graced enough teen magazine covers to fill a room. By his early 20s, the young heartthrob market had moved on, as it always does, and the transition to adult roles proved difficult. He was working, auditioning, trying to build a different kind of career, but the industry's indifference to people it had recently been enthusiastic about was wearing on him. On November 11, 2003, he took his own life. He was 26 years old. He had finished a film called Bad Girls from Valley High earlier that year. It was released after his death. Fans who remember the boy in the Stephen King miniseries who made them afraid of storm drains for a while have not forgotten him. We head now to Edmond, Oklahoma, in the suburbs of Oklahoma City, which is not a place most people would think to look for a Hollywood name. But Dana Plato spent the last portion of her life in this part of the country, and this is where she rests. Dana Plato was 13 years old when she was cast as Kimberly Drummond on Different Strokes, the NBC sitcom that ran from 1978 to 1986, and that made household names of Gary Coleman and Todd Bridges alongside her. She played the teenage stepdaughter of the Drummond family, a relatively minor role in a show that revolved more centrally around Coleman's Arnold. But she was a presence for 8 years on one of the most watched shows on television. The problem was that she became pregnant in 1984 and was written off the show, and the years that followed were a painful demonstration of how difficult it is to build a career after being a child star without the structures that might have helped her. She struggled with addiction through the late 1980s and 1990s, and a 1991 robbery of a Las Vegas video store with a pellet gun resulted in a conviction and probation. She was working hard to rebuild by the late 1990s and had made an appearance on The Howard Stern Show just the day before she died, on May 8, 1999, of an accidental overdose of the painkiller Carisoprodol and the antidepressant Valium. She was 34 years old. In a dark coda, her son Tyler Lambert died by his own hand the following year in 2010. He was 25. From Oklahoma, we travel east and then south to East Tennessee, to the Knoxville area, where Brad Renfro grew up and where his family brought him home. Brad Renfro grew up right here in East Tennessee, and he was a local kid, 12 years old, living with his grandparents, when he was discovered by a casting director in 1994 and cast as the young boy who befriends a retired Nazi judge in The Client, the John Grisham adaptation directed by Joel Schumacher. His performance was completely natural and entirely unaffected, and it launched a career that proceeded with a kind of unvarnished honesty. Apt Pupil in 1998, in which he played a teenager who uncovers a Nazi war criminal living quietly in his neighborhood, was perhaps his finest performance, a study in how fascination curdles into complicity, played with a chilling subtlety. Tom and Huck, Sleeper's Ghost World. He struggled with heroin addiction through his 20s, with arrests and attempts at sobriety and the ordinary grinding difficulty of that battle. He died on January 15, 2008, of acute heroin and morphine toxicity. He was 25 years old. His hometown burial here in Blount County is appropriate. He never lost his East Tennessee accent, never seemed to want to, and there is something right about him coming home. From Tennessee, we travel the farthest distance on our entire tour, all the way to Perth, Western Australia, where Karrakatta Cemetery sits on the western edge of the city near the Indian Ocean. And the reason we've come this far is because the young man resting here gave us, in his final completed performance, something that the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences recognized as the finest supporting performance of the year. Heath Ledger was born in Perth in 1979, grew up here, and left for America in his late teens to build a career in Hollywood. He was charming and unpretentious in 10 Things I Hate About You in 1999, the film that introduced him to American audiences. And he followed it steadily with Monsters Ball, Lords of Dogtown, and then his Oscar-nominated performance as Ennis Del Mar in Brokeback Mountain in 2005. The restraint of that performance, the way Ledger's Ennis kept everything pressed down and locked away until it became unbearable, was remarkable. And then, The Dark Knight. Christopher Nolan's Joker is one of the most discussed performances in recent cinema history, not for the usual reasons that actor-playing villain discussions arise, but because of its genuine strangeness, its unpredictability, the sense that something was happening on screen that nobody quite knew how to categorize. Ledger had thrown himself into the preparation with an intensity that isolated him for extended periods. On January 22, 2008, he was found unconscious in his Manhattan apartment by his masseuse and was pronounced dead by paramedics. The cause of death was an accidental overdose of prescription medications, a combination of opioids, benzodiazepines, and other drugs. He was 28 years old. He was awarded the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor posthumously, the award accepted by his family. He rests here in Perth, in the city where his story started, and the distance from Hollywood could not be more complete. We travel northwest to Tennessee one more time, to Dickson County, where a working horse farm that might not appear on any tourist map was the final home of one of television's most beloved actors. Luke Perry grew up in Fredericktown, Ohio, and broke into Hollywood through soap operas. He had roles on Loving and Another World before being cast as Dylan McKay on Beverly Hills 90210, which premiered on Fox in 1990, and quickly became a cultural phenomenon that defined early 1990s teen culture as completely as any television show has ever defined anything. Perry's Dylan was the brooding, complicated one. Damaged family, too much money, not enough of the right kind of love. And Perry played him with a genuine complexity that distinguished the character from the more straightforward teen drama types around him. He was also, in real life, considerably warmer and more self-deprecating than Dylan McKay, and his fans tended to discover that if they ever met him. He appeared in Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood in 2019, in a smaller role that demonstrated he had never stopped working at the craft. He later starred in Riverdale, the CW series that gave him a second major pop cultural moment, playing Archie's father, Fred Andrews, with warmth and steadiness that made the character feel like the moral center of the show. On February 27, 2019, Luke Perry suffered a massive ischemic stroke at his home in Sherman Oaks, California. He never regained consciousness and died 5 days later, on March 4, 2019. He was 52. His family buried him on his farm in Dickson County, Tennessee, under a tree in the ground he had worked and loved. He had asked to be buried in a mushroom burial suit, an eco-friendly burial shroud that uses fungi to break down the body and return it to the earth, and his daughter confirmed this was honored. It is perhaps the most down-to-earth ending imaginable for a man who was every teenage girl's idea of glamour. Steve McQueen needs no particular introduction, but the manner of his final years contains a story that most people don't know. And his final resting place, or rather, the lack of a fixed one, says something about the man. McQueen grew up hard. Absent father, troubled youth, reform school, the Marines, and came to Hollywood with an edge that was entirely real and entirely his own. By the mid-1960s, he was one of the biggest stars in the world. The Great Escape, The Magnificent Seven, Bullet, the chase scene through the streets of San Francisco in Bullet, is still a benchmark for automotive action filmmaking. He was the highest paid actor in the world in 1974, He was also, privately, already ill with what would be diagnosed as mesothelioma, a cancer of the lung lining almost always caused by asbestos exposure. McQueen believed he had been exposed to asbestos from the insulation in racing suits and ships he had worked on during his military service. He tried unconventional treatments in Mexico when American medicine had given up, and he died on November 7, 1980, in Juarez, Mexico, following surgery. He was 50 years old. Per his wishes, he was cremated and his ashes scattered in the Pacific Ocean. There is no grave. There is simply the memory of a man who moved through the world at his own particular speed and on his own terms, right up to the end. Patrick Swayze was in certain respects the most complete performer on this tour. Dancer, actor, singer, horseman. A man of genuine physical gifts who used all of them, and used them well. Dirty Dancing in 1987 made him a phenomenon, and Ghost in 1990, the romantic fantasy that became one of the highest-grossing films of its year, showed a sensitivity and gentleness that complicated the action hero image he'd established in Red Dawn. Point Break, in 1991, remains one of those films that people discover and immediately want to talk about. In January 2008, he was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. He gave an interview to Barbara Walters in the middle of his treatment, looking thin but undefeated, talking with remarkable candor about what he was facing and how he was choosing to face it. He continued to work. He starred in the Andy series The Beast, completing its run in the final year of his life. He died on September 14, 2009, 20 months after his diagnosis. He was 57 years old. His ashes were scattered at his ranch in New Mexico, the place where he had been most himself, where he kept his horses, and the land that grounded him. Robin Williams is not on this tour because he died young in years. He was 63. He is on this tour because the manner of his death and the medical diagnosis that contributed to it revealed something about suffering that changed how millions of people think about mental illness, and because the loss still doesn't feel complete. Williams was diagnosed posthumously with Lewy body dementia, a disease that causes a progressive deterioration of the brain, and had been producing symptoms he couldn't explain. Paranoia, confusion, physical symptoms that didn't quite fit any diagnosis his doctors were pursuing. Parkinson's disease had been what they were treating. The Lewy body dementia was discovered only at autopsy. He took his own life on August 11, 2014, at his home in Paradise Cay, California. His wife, Susan Schneider Williams, wrote afterward that the Lewy body dementia had been severe, more extensive than most cases his doctors had seen, and that he had been in a kind of private terror that he had been struggling to conceal from even those closest to him. She called it the terrorist inside his brain. What Williams gave to American culture across 4 decades is almost impossible to summarize. Mork from Ork on Happy Days, and Mork and Mindy beginning in 1978, when his energy exploded out of the television set in a way that made you feel the screen could barely contain him. Popeye and Robert Altman's 1980 film, Moscow on the Hudson, Good Morning Vietnam, for which he received his first Academy Award nomination. Dead Poets Society, in which his John Keating inspired a generation of English teachers and a generation of students who wanted teachers like that. The Fisher King. Aladdin, in which he voiced the genie with an improvisational freedom that transformed what animated performance could be. Mrs. Doubtfire, Good Will Hunting, for which he won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor in 1997, and his acceptance speech was characteristically gracious and funny. Patch Adams, 1 Hour Photo, which showed a dark precision the comedy roles had never required. His stand-up comedy was in a category of its own, a stream of consciousness improvisation that moved so fast you sometimes couldn't tell where one idea ended and the next began. And that rewarded watching multiple times because you had missed half of it at regular speed. He was funny and warm and frightening and gentle and generous, and it turns out he was suffering in ways that nobody around him fully understood. His ashes were scattered in San Francisco Bay, the city where his career had its roots, where the comedy club stages had given him his first real audiences. There is no grave. The world simply does not have a place to put him, which is, in a strange way, appropriate. From San Francisco Bay, we travel south and east to Hartsdale, New York and Ferncliff Cemetery, a large, well-manicured cemetery in Westchester County that has become the resting place of numerous prominent figures over the decades, including Judy Garland. We're here for someone who had barely turned 22 when her life ended in a plane crash over the Atlantic Ocean. Aaliyah Dana Houghton, known professionally simply as Aaliyah, was one of the defining voices of R&B in the 1990s and early 2000s. She had her first hit record at 14. Her work with producers Timbaland and Missy Elliott produced a sound that was genuinely new, rhythmically displaced, layered, cool in a way that influenced nearly everything that followed it in popular music. She had also built a parallel acting career that was just beginning to take hold. She had appeared in Romeo Must Die in 2000 and Queen of the Damned in 2002, and she had been cast in the Matrix sequels. On August 25, 2001, she and 8 members of her entourage boarded a small Cessna 402 in the Bahamas, where she had just finished filming a music video. The plane was overloaded and crashed shortly after takeoff. All 9 people aboard were killed. She was 22 years old. The impact of her death on her fan base was immense, and in the 2 decades since, her music has not diminished in its influence. If anything, it has grown. She rests at Ferncliff Cemetery in the mausoleum there, and the fan visits continue to this day. Not far from Ferncliff, or at least in the general constellation of the New York area, let's acknowledge a figure whose burial actually has no permanent public location, because his ashes were scattered, but whose place in American culture is impossible to overlook. We're pausing here to remember Tupac Shakur, technically on the edges of this tour since his primary identity was as a rapper rather than an actor, but his film career was real and substantial enough to earn his place. He appeared in Juice in 1992 in a performance that was genuinely startling for a first major film role, and Above the Rim in 1994, and Poetic Justice in 1993 alongside Janet Jackson. He was building something as a screen actor that his music had perhaps overshadowed. On the night of September 7, 1996, he was shot multiple times in a drive-by shooting in Las Vegas following a Mike Tyson boxing match. He died 6 days later on September 13, 1996. He was 25 years old. His ashes were reportedly scattered in various locations, including California and possibly South Africa. The investigation into his murder was never resolved with a prosecution, and the case remains one of the most discussed unsolved crimes in American music history. Now we come to a stop that is, if you'll allow a brief moment of appreciation for the absurdity of fate, one of the most ironic on this entire tour. We're at Romy Schneider's grave in the small village of Boissy-Saint-Avoire, about 40 miles southwest of Paris, in a country churchyard that is about as far from Hollywood as you can get while still being in a place of deliberate beauty. Romy Schneider was Austrian, born in 1938, the daughter of actors, and she became a massive star as a teenager playing Empress Sisi, the young Empress of Austria, in a beloved trilogy of Austrian films in the 1950s that were so successful, they essentially imprisoned her in the image of that particular role. Her escape from that image, achieved by moving to Paris and working with the French cinema's finest directors, was the great act of artistic courage in her life. She made films with Claude Sautet that are considered masterpieces of French cinema, and she won the César Award, the French Oscar, twice. American audiences may know her best from What's New, Pussycat? From 1965, in which she appeared alongside Peter Sellers and Peter O'Toole. Her personal life was marked by grief upon grief. Her son David died in a freak accident in 1981, impaled on a fence while trying to climb it at the age of 14. The loss never left her. She died on May 29, 1982, of cardiac arrest. She was 43 years old. She is buried here in this quiet village where she had a country home, a place she had chosen for its peace, in a churchyard that receives visitors from across Europe who come to pay respects to one of the most gifted European actresses of the 20th century. We're going to make one stop in the Midwest, Fairview Cemetery in Penn Argyl, Pennsylvania, a small borough in the Slate Belt of eastern Pennsylvania where you would not expect to find the grave of one of Hollywood's most outrageous blondes. Jayne Mansfield was a deliberate and extremely self-aware creation. She was not simply a blonde bombshell who happened to cross paths with publicity. She orchestrated her own fame with an intelligence and a sense of performance that is more interesting in retrospect than her public image suggested. She was formally trained. She studied at the University of Texas and UCLA, and she was genuinely funny, particularly on stage and in her early film work. She sang, she played violin, she spoke 5 languages. She was a walking, performing argument against taking any of it at face value. Will success spoil Rock Hunter? From 1957 showed what she could do when given genuinely comic material. On June 29, 1967, she was riding in a car on U.S. Highway 90 in Louisiana when it struck a tractor-trailer rig at high speed. She was killed instantly, along with the driver and another passenger. Her 3 children, also in the car, survived. She was 34 years old. An enduring urban legend claims she was decapitated. She was not. The misapprehension arose from a photograph that showed a blonde wig at the scene. She was buried in her hometown, Penn Argyl, where her family roots were, far from the California circus. Let's cross to Colorado for a moment, to a cemetery in the Denver area where, by a somewhat circuitous journey that the project files on this tour have already documented, a young actor was moved after originally being buried in Hollywood. Brandon DeWilde was a prodigy of the American stage and screen. He made his Broadway debut as a child, and he starred in the film version of The Member of the Wedding, which earned him a Golden Globe for his work. But the role that made him famous, the one that lodged itself in the American memory, was Joey in Shane in 1953. At the end of that film, as Alan Ladd's lone gunfighter rides away, young Joey's voice crying, "Shane, come back," became one of the most iconic moments in the history of the Western. He was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for the performance. He was 10 years old. He worked steadily through the 1950s and into the 1960s, appearing in films and on television, successfully making the transition to adult roles that defeats many child actors. He appeared in HUD in 1963 alongside Paul Newman, a film we remember for several strong performances. On July 6, 1972, he was driving in Denver when his van collided with a semi-truck. He died from his injuries. He was 30 years old. He was originally buried in Hollywood but was later moved closer to his family, coming to rest near the place he had built his adult life. We returned to the East Coast for our final 2 stops. First to Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles, which we visited several times today, for one last story. And then we'll end this tour in a very particular place. John Garfield was one of the most compelling actors of the 1940s, a tough-talking New Yorker who brought a genuine street-level intensity to film roles that the more polished leading men of the era couldn't quite replicate. He had grown up poor on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, found his way to the stage through the Group Theater in New York, alongside such luminaries as Lee Strasberg and Clifford Odets, and made his Hollywood debut in Four Daughters in 1938, for which he received an Academy Award nomination in his first major film appearance. He was 25 years old, and the audience recognized something in him immediately. This was a man who had been to the bottom and understood what he found there. Body and Soul in 1947, a boxing film, really a film about selling out and what it costs, and Force of Evil in 1948, one of the great American noirs, showed him at full power. He was also, in the late 1940s and early 1950s, caught up in the Red Scare and the House Un-American Activities Committee investigations that destroyed so many careers in Hollywood. He was subpoenaed, interrogated, pressured to name names. He refused to do so. He was willing to talk about himself but would not name others, and as a result was effectively blacklisted and unable to get work. The stress of the investigations, the injustice of what was happening to him, the helplessness of watching his career be dismantled. By most accounts, it weighed on him enormously. He was also dealing with a heart condition he'd had since childhood. On May 21, 1952, he died of a heart attack in New York. He was 39 years old. Arthur Miller later said that the HUAC investigation killed Garfield as surely as if they had shot him. He rests at George Washington Memorial Park in Paramus, New Jersey, back near the city where he had started, the city that made him. And so we come, at last, to our final stop. A private family plot in a small, unincorporated community in north-central Florida, a place called Macanopy. You have to want to find it. There are no signs pointing the way, no tourist markers, no celebrity cemetery map that directs you here. It is simply a family's land, and in it rests a young man who, in the years since he died, has become something of a symbol for what is lost when a life of unusual promise is cut short. River Phoenix was 23 years old on the night of October 31st, 1993, Halloween, when he collapsed on the sidewalk outside the Viper Room nightclub on Sunset Strip in West Hollywood and died of acute multiple drug and alcohol intoxication. His brother Joaquin, now one of the finest actors in American cinema, was on the phone calling for help. His sister Rain was there. It was a terrible night, witnessed by too many people. And it became one of those events that a generation of moviegoers remember exactly where they were when they heard. But let's begin where his story really starts. Because the story of River Phoenix is not a cautionary tale. It is the story of a genuinely exceptional talent that the world was lucky to have for as long as it did. He was born River Jude Bottom in Madras, Oregon, in 1970. His parents were missionaries for a group called the Children of God, and he and his 4 siblings, Rain, Joaquin, Liberty, and Summer, spent years living nomadically in Venezuela, Puerto Rico, and other locations before the family returned to the United States in the late 1970s and resettled in Florida. The children busked on the streets of Gainesville to help support the family. He began acting as a child out of economic necessity, and by his teenage years it was clear he was doing something beyond what most trained adult actors could do. Stand By Me in 1986. He was 15, playing Chris Chambers with a gravity and tenderness that anchored the film and made you feel genuinely protective of a fictional 12-year-old boy. Running on Empty in 1988, directed by Sidney Lumet, earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor at the age of 17. He played Danny Pope, the son of 1960s radical fugitives, a young man who has never had the ordinary life he longs for. And the performance was so fully realized, it stunned critics who expected something rawer from a teenager. The Mosquito Coast with Harrison Ford in 1986 had shown his range even earlier. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade in 1989 gave him the young Harrison Ford, an act of physical impersonation so convincing it made everyone smile. Sneakers, I Love You to Death, Dogfight, a body of work building towards something. My Own Private Idaho in 1991, directed by Gus Van Sant, in which Phoenix played Mike Waters, a narcoleptic street hustler in Portland trying to find his missing mother, contained what many critics and filmmakers still consider one of the finest pieces of screen acting of the decade. The campfire scene, in which Mike confesses his love to his friend Scott, played by Keanu Reeves, is so emotionally raw and precisely calibrated that it still stops people cold. He improvised significant portions of it. He was 20 years old when he filmed it, and he was doing something that most actors twice his age couldn't have done once. He was also, genuinely, a person of strong convictions, a committed vegan before it was fashionable, an environmental activist, a musician who played in a band called Alika's Attic and took that seriously too. He had turned down numerous high-profile commercial roles because they conflicted with his values. He thought carefully about the kind of work he wanted to do and the kind of person he wanted to be. At the time of his death, he was preparing to film Interview with the Vampire, a role that ultimately went to Christian Slater. The addiction that ultimately took him was real, but it was not the whole of him, and it should not be the last word on him. His brother Joaquin has carried a piece of that loss publicly and privately for 30 years and has become, arguably, the finest actor of his generation. There is a line between them, between River's raw emotional access and Joaquin's similar willingness to go to extreme places, that feels less like coincidence than like inheritance. River Phoenix is buried here in Micanopy, Florida, on his family's land, away from Hollywood, away from the industry that employed him, in a quiet piece of ground that his family tended before him and tends still. No celebrities are nearby. No famous names share the view. Just a young man from a complicated life in a simple place, returned to the earth before the rest of his story could be told. That is our tour. 50 lives, 50 stops, from a small cemetery in Indiana to the back roads of Florida. We've walked through the grand mausoleums of Forest Lawn and the windswept hillside on Martha's Vineyard. We've crossed to Paris and back, made a stop in Perth and another in Puerto Rico. We've stood in a Quaker cemetery in Brooklyn for Montgomery Clift and in a country churchyard in South Carolina for Chadwick Boseman. We've followed Bruce Lee and Brandon Lee to Seattle, where a father and son rest side by side. We've remembered people who died in plane crashes and car crashes and from illness and from violence and from circumstances that nobody adequately explained. We've visited a few whose deaths were ruled accidental and a few whose deaths were not accidents at all. What all 50 had in common was that the movies needed them, and that when they left, the movies felt it. Some of them, like James Dean, left before the full shape of what they might have been could even be guessed at. Others, like Robin Williams and Patrick Swayze, gave us decades of work and then left us wanting more. All of them, in their own way, did something irreplaceable. The screen was different because of them. Thank you for spending this time with us. Safe travels home.